everyone, my name is Catherine Gorley, and I'd like to thank you for tuning in today for another episode of the Injury Prevention Academy, a podcast brought to you by DORN Companies, the country's leading wellness-based pain management and injury prevention company. DORN is committed to reducing costs of healthcare and workers' compensation, as well as reducing lost productivity, which has resulted in over $120 million in savings over the last 20 years for our clients. Joining us today is Mike Harnett. Mike Harnett is a human factors professional with a background in sleep neurobiology and organizational fatigue management. She's worked with various government agencies, including the Federal Rail Association, NASA, and Transport Canada, as well as private industry, including oil and gas, mining, manufacturing, and film sectors. Welcome, Mike.
Hello. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for joining us. I really look forward to kind of hearing a little bit more of just what you've seen in the fatigue sector.
It's quite broad. That's the
Yes,
beauty
it
of being
is.
a consultant.
Right? Because DORN recently did a think tank with global HR and wellness directors, and fatigue was in their top 3 issues seen. It was just that underlying thread through everything we talked about. And it was also a frequent topic of discussion at the recent ASSP conference. So how has the spike in this focus in the last 2 years really shaped the safety programs that we're seeing out there?
I think overall we just have a better understanding of fatigue and its impact at the workplace, and the fact that when we talk about concepts like fit for work or fit for duty, that in the past it was all about focusing on drugs and alcohol and making people pee in a cup, and we realize now that there's so much more to the holistic approach of someone being fit for work, and fatigue is very much a part of that. And we know that from a fatigue perspective that it impacts all of what I call the other pillars of fit for duty. So if, for instance, somebody has a physical health impairment, if they have a back injury, how is that affecting their ability to fall asleep or stay asleep? If somebody is going through a stressful event, maybe they're going through a divorce, maybe they're turning to, alcohol or something to help them get through it, but now that's
Right.
impacting their sleep, or the stress itself is impacting their sleep. So fatigue is consequently tied to almost every other safety initiative that we have.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think these last 2 years, last 18 months or so, I think has really kind of lasered in on that focus, because it's become that topic of main conversation of how do we manage fatigue in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no one simple way. It's interesting. I had a client discussion the other day, and they kept trying to emphasize, well, we just want you for the fatigue science. And I said, well, the fatigue science doesn't change from industry to industry. The fatigue science is the fatigue science. What changes is my ability to take that science and apply it into the context of your organization. That's when you're going to reap the benefits of any fatigue management efforts. But if
Mhm.
you're looking to buy a program off of a shelf, you're not going to see results.
No, it's really about what I've seen within the field of fatigue, especially in different sectors like manufacturing, like distribution. It's all about really, I'd say, listening to your employees and developing a communication as to what's truly causing that fatigue in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a big part of it. One thing we have to be cautious about, though, is that we often look at fatigue as a worker issue, right? Tying it into the
Mhm.
fact that they're coming to work fatigued. But what we have to do is recognize that there's a shared responsibility, because there are work factors that can contribute to the development of fatigue. Poorly designed work schedules, as a really good example, where if an employee doesn't, it doesn't matter what an employee does in their off hours, if their work schedule doesn't allow them to get the requirement of sleep that they need. So we have to look at the fundamentals of how we've designed our jobs in the first place, and are we setting them up for fatigue, or are we setting them up for failure?
Right, because according to the National Safety Council, more than 2/3 of workers say that they are tired at work. And that can be, based around the actual, say, job at hand. It can be the hours, it can be the almost separation of work and personal life, making sure that that separation is there.
Yeah.
So how do we truly identify fatigue in different fields and industries and really create that open communication about it?
It's going to come down to doing an assessment of where we are, right? What do we currently have in place to manage fatigue? How are we handling it? How are we culturally accepting it? If we have for lack of better terminology, an immature safety culture, then we're certainly not going to have a mature fatigue management culture.
Right.
So the culture has to be driven by senior leadership for sure. They have to walk the walk, they have to talk the talk, and they have to put in the strategic foundation that will support any fatigue management efforts. So fatigue management is not about training employees how to sleep better. It's not about putting the focus on the employees, solely on the employees. One of the most fundamental things is we have to accept that fatigue is a part of our normal human condition. We're all going to be tired at some point. We're all going to show up
Right.
exhausted because the baby kept us up all night or something along that
Hmm.
line. So by changing the focus away from focusing on tired employees and focusing on the risk at the job site, then we are better off managing how we can control the situation. So if there's work elements that we need to modify, such as work schedules or other workplace factors that could be contributing, in ergonomic issues that could be contributing to fatigue, that's one thing. But regardless, we're never going to eliminate fatigue from showing up at the work site. So what
Hmm.
we need to do is identify how does risk get impacted if fatigue shows up. So for example, when we have a manager, we have a lot of managers will go, what do you mean my employees are tired? I'm tired. What's the big deal, right? Well, the big deal is that you as a manager sitting behind a computer and having a microsleep is a lot different risk level from somebody who's holding a chainsaw or operating a big truck or in those
Yes.
safety sensitive environments in front of a control panel.
Hmm.
So it's recognizing that fatigue in and of itself can be a hazard, absolutely, but we have to look at our existing hazards and the risks that are attached to them that already are in place out there, and now look at it through a fatigue lens and say, okay, this job we know has this hazard. How much more risky does it become when a tired employee does it? How can we better design that job to prevent that from developing into something more serious?
Right. And I think having that understanding between the employees and the supervisors and even senior management, that I mean it very much is making sure that everyone is on the same page with regards to how they're going to, even on a day-to-day basis, or even
Mhm.
when they're looking at their overall goals for, say, the year, they need to figure out how to recognize those kind of things that are going to come up.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, it comes back to the very beginning. Understand where your risks are and where fatigue plays a role. And from
Mhm.
there, you can now set your targets and objectives. Where do you want to get with this fatigue management program? And now you can start measuring against it. You can start collecting metrics and KPIs can be established. But without that, nobody's driving the program. Nobody knows if there's an effect. And this is where we find a lot of times if fatigue management is being housed under a wellness program, we often don't have metrics attached to it or targets and objectives.
Mhm.
Whereas if it's housed underneath health and safety, then there's more onus and more responsibility to tie it into operational values and having metrics and having KPIs. So it can be influenced very much by how you even approach it within the organization, who's going to be in charge of championing the program.
Right. And DORN has a program called Alert Meter where it's more of a gamified system to measure fatigue, establish that
Right.
baseline as to where an employee or even a supervisor is on any given day. And if that is skewed in some way on, someone comes into the work site and they've been up all night, you know,
Yeah.
it's going to create that alert. And I think having that open communication about some of those causes and having that data there is ultimately what really I think informs the safety
Mhm.
on a production floor or at a job site.
It does. It's another layer of protection. And I mean, there's so many great tools out there, and Alert Meter is one of them. But
Hmm.
what we have to keep in context is that these are simply tools. They're not
Hmm.
solutions.
Right.
And unfortunately, I see a lot of certain technological groups that will come in and say, "We've got the solution for you. It's eye tracking, or it's this, or it's that." And it's not, because most of those are detecting fatigue after the fact that somebody's tired.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
in essence, what have we done to prevent fatigue from showing up in the first place? Knowing we won't always be able to prevent that anyway, but the reality being that um, we just need to make sure that we understand what these tools bring in terms of value. And it's one thing for a tool to say, hey, somebody's tired. It's another thing for that tool to say, hey, this employee's tired. Here's what you should do now. And unfortunately, a lot of the
Right.
tools don't go that next step. They basically say, yep,
Mhm.
you got a tired employee. Up to you now.
Okay.
and uh, and I don't know how much value there is in that approach if the company has kind of been sold this bill of goods that this is a solution they need and that's going to take care of their fatigue problem. They need to
Okay.
understand it has to be multi-layered and multiple controls to really have an effective program.
Right. Um, and I like the idea of fatigue. Just it really encompasses a lot of things. It can encompass sleep. It can encompass even mental health. Someone can be emotionally fatigued with
Hmm.
with what's going
Hmm.
on.
Yeah.
So how I know I asked you about kind of a shift in focus towards fatigue, but how has that really encompassed mental health as well?
Yeah, that's a really strong connection. But for many, many years, we've always been debating, what comes first, chicken or the egg? And it always kind of leaned that stress was the cause of a lot of our insomnia and sleeplessness and those types of
Hmm.
anxieties and things. But the more recent literature has finally established that, well, you know what? A lot of it, especially in today's world, is driven by lack of sleep. So the fact that as a society, we're not getting the amount of sleep that we biologically need to fully restore our brain means that we're also not restoring our emotional capabilities and tolerances. So if you're tired because you didn't get a good night's sleep and now you're exposed to something stressful, we actually see an enhancement of your fight or flight response. Your emotional response gets heightened. And that
Hmm.
even leads to people being more susceptible to PTSD, all because you didn't get a good night's sleep. So the
Right.
fact that sleep makes you more vulnerable to stress and heightened levels of it is really the kicker here. And then now, once you're in that cycle, now it just keeps feeding off of each other. The more stress, the more you can't sleep. The more stress, the more you can't sleep, and it
Yes.
becomes yeah, something tough to get out of.
Right. And that can be, I think, applied to really almost any job out there. It's not,
Oh
you
yeah.
know, it's not just heavy industry. I know you've worked in, government, you've worked in film. I mean, this this affects so many different people in a variety of ways.
Yeah, there's no rhyme or reason as to how it's going to affect an individual because stress is, first and foremost, individual to
Internal.
each of us.
Hmm.
But we do know that there are certain psychological components within an organizational structure that will make an environment more stressful to the majority of employees. And that's why, we had the psychological health and safety standard that was the world's first, was created here in Canada. And then that fed
Hmm.
into an international standard of psychological health and safety,
Right.
because we know the impact that certain workplace environments can how they can affect employees and set them up for additional stress than what they really need or any of us need.
Right. And then you mentioned sleep, since obviously companies can't control how much their employees sleep. What I mean, they try,
Yeah, yeah.
but it usually doesn't work. What solutions have you seen out there that companies could use to, I'd say, better inform their employees?
A lot. There's so many, but the
Okay.
key here, of course, is understanding where you're at first, right? So you don't know if you have an issue of sleep with your employees until you ask. So whether it's
Right.
a survey or whatever pros focus group, however you want to do it, we use surveys a lot, which really help us understand the degree to which employees are suffering from either a lack of sleep or poor quality sleep, or have sleep
Mhm.
disorders, or have maybe they're turning to sleep aids, like medications or alcohol, or maybe they have a health condition that's affecting their sleep. Until
Mhm.
you ask these questions and you look at that kind of data, you really don't know whether or not to devote resources to that issue, right? So once
Yes.
you've identified that, if you find in fact that, and I'd be surprised to find that we wouldn't have a sleep problem in most organizations these days,
Yeah.
we have to recognize that sleep just hasn't been given the respect that it's due. And again, if you think of it from a leadership perspective, how many people in very important positions got there by sacrificing sleep? They were the first ones to show up and turn the lights on, the last ones to leave and turn the lights off, and they got
Mhm.
rewarded for it. So it's this badge of honor.
Mhm.
So if that's how the work culture was established, it's really hard for the organization to kind of buy in and say, yeah, 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 we got to deal with these tired workers. They don't understand that. So we need to do education not just at the employee level. We
Mhm.
need to educate the business case side of things for management. We need to educate supervisors in how to identify fatigued employees and what to do with those fatigued employees.
Mhm.
Because right now we're letting them fly by the seat of their pants and try to figure out what to do with them, right? And if you like
Right.
the employee, the supervisor might say, yeah, go sneak off to the truck and grab 10 minutes. I'll come and get you when I need you. But if they don't like the employee, it might be, I'm writing you up. This is discipline. I'm sending you home. You're suspended. So in
And the stress
lieu,
just compounds itself.
exactly. So we certainly need to understand that education isn't just about sleep, and it's not just about the employees. It's those other levels. But from a sleep perspective, the employees need to be educated on the very basics because we didn't get it in school. It wasn't something that most of us were ever taught about because we didn't have the science behind us. I started in this field over 30 years ago, and for the first 15 years, we were throwing darts at a wall and hoping something would stick to see what would happen. But
Mhm.
now we have the longitudinal studies, we have the evidence, we understand sleep neurobiology so much better. Now we can give constructive, good advice to the employees and to the organization on how to better manage the opportunity for sleep and for the employees to get better quality and quantity of sleep.
So how do we manage some of the things that you've seen obviously change over the last couple of years? I know that a big part of the last 2 years has been things like virtual meetings on platforms like this one,
Yeah.
like all Zoom, GoToMeeting, Teams. It's become the norm. So
Mhm.
how do we, and this is very, I'd say, a new field of study, because this is something
Yeah.
that really was pushed on a lot of people in a very, very fast timeline. So how do we manage the fatigue seen from this? And I've seen more and more often people talking about actually how women on average are more affected by some of the virtual platforms.
Yeah, I think there's, well, it is really kind of in its infancy in terms of being studied. There is some
Hmm.
really good information that is coming out of places like Stanford University. One of the things I find fascinating is that, first off, this is such an atypical, unnatural environment to be communicating in, right? And
Hmm.
I'm used to speaking to large groups or walking across the stage. And as you can see, my hands are constantly moving. And that's such a natural part of our communication is the unnoticed behaviors that subconsciously we pick up on, and
Hmm.
that's taken away when we're in these environments. Now, the cognitive load is so much more because we're focusing on what we look like in the screen. We're looking at ourselves, which is feedback. Can you imagine walking around with somebody holding a mirror in front of you all day long? Right?
it,
Or
it'd
going
be
to a
exhausting.
meeting. Yeah,
Yeah.
going to a meeting room and having a big mirror there all the time. The fact
Hmm.
that we're constantly looking ourselves, especially as women, judging ourselves. What do we look like? Is our hair out of place? What's our makeup look
Hmm.
like?
Right.
And then you add, what does my background look like? There's all these other factors that have nothing to do with the meeting and would never be in place if you were having a face to face, but they're here now.
Right.
So, and they create a cognitive load. And if you're somebody who is more introverted or socially anxious, you feel all these eyes looking directly at you now. Whereas in a
Hmm.
normal meeting, you're not constantly staring at one person, right? You're looking around, et cetera, et cetera. But all you
Yes.
feel in these meetings is everybody looking at you. So
Hmm.
it can be incredibly socially anxious for people and trigger different kinds of levels of fatigue and stress.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so different, obviously, like you
Mhm.
said, just in the last year and a half, 2 years. But I think people getting used to those kind of stressors, and also
Yeah.
figuring out how to make it work for them. So all of a sudden saying, you know what, I'm going to attend this meeting, but I'm not going to have my camera on.
Yeah.
It's creating those, I'd say, more self-aware tactics for yourself
Mhm.
to combat some of that fatigue from day-to-day meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. The unfortunate side, of course, is there's still some companies that kind of like to big brother their employees, and you must have your camera on, and we're going to check in with you every hour, make sure you're at your desk, and
Right.
that just goes to again show more of a lack of cultural maturity, where they
Mhm.
don't even trust their employees to do the jobs that they're hired to do,
Right.
which I think says more about their hiring process than anything.
And I think would obviously create a lot of stress separately from that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It just again, the fatigue and stress just feed off of each other. So yeah, I think things like being able to turn off your camera, being able to pull yourself away from the stress of it. Even just simple things like reducing the size of your screen instead of having it full size, so that
Mm.
you don't have one
Mhm.
great big head staring at you. And there's different ways that we can individually manage it, but
Mhm.
when you look at younger generations too, a lot of them, when they're away from the Zoom meeting, now they're face to face on the phone. And so they're not helping the situation, right?
Mhm.
So there's a lot that we can do individually, but corporately as well.
Right. And having those discussions as an organization as
Mhm.
to how you can best manage just your day-to-day operations and day-to-day goals with those I'd say fatigue goals in mind.
Yeah, and I think the key word there is fatigue goals, and having organizations recognize that again, fatigue management is not a program, it's not a training program. Fatigue management is an ongoing evolutionary process, and it needs to be driven by continuous improvement. And that
Mhm.
means you need to set your targets and your objectives, and you need to know what it is you're driving towards. Are you looking at reducing overtime, which is creating a lot of fatigue out there? Are you looking at putting in a process to make sure that if somebody's going to be putting in overtime, are you monitoring them to make sure they're still fit for duty? Because if they're all of a sudden working 16 hours, 17 hours, 18 hours, and now they're driving home after that, well, at
Right,
17 hours of wakefulness, you are now legally impaired. You're at 0.05%, at least legally impaired in Canada, but at
mhm,
0.05% blood alcohol equivalency. And if you've been awake for 20 to 21 hours, you're at zero point zero 0.08. God forbid you're awake
mhm,
24 hours, but there are some
right,
that will work those kinds of hours. And the next thing you know, they're
absolutely.
at 0.10.
Right, I think you frequently see some of those kind of hours in medical fields, in entertainment jobs,
Yeah.
especially when you're working on a film set. You're
Yeah.
seeing very, very long hours.
I think the biggest concern is anyone who works shift work and goes on to night shift, because what we tend to see is the majority of people, when they're going to be going on to their very first night shift in the block
Hmm.
of shifts, they'll wake up as if they're on their daytime schedule, like they've just come off of days off. So they'll wake up maybe 6, 7, 8 in the morning, and they'll stay awake all day, and then they'll report to their night shift, and now they're up for 12 hours,
However, yes.
right? And then by the time they finish their first night shift, they've been awake 18, 20, 22 hours, no problem. And now we're saying, okay, bye-bye, drive home safe. And
Right.
it's the number one response I get when I ask shift workers to tell me what is the worst shift they work, they'll always say, the majority will always say, it's my first night shift, because they don't know how that long hours of wakefulness is really setting them up for failure the rest of the week. But they get to this
Yes.
impaired state that they don't recognize how impaired they are. It's like asking a drunk, how drunk are you, right? They really can't describe it very
Hmm.
well.
Right. Right. Now, I know that you are joining us from Canada, which is
Yes.
awesome. So how does that approach to fatigue management have you seen differ from Canada to the US? And is do you feel like the global community is coming closer to approaching it in kind of a unified way, or is it very much still kind of individualized?
Yeah, I think fundamentally, it comes down again to that health and safety maturity of an organization and their own workplace culture. In
Hmm.
Canada, health and safety and subsequently the whole concept of risk management is controlled through health and safety professionals. But
Okay.
when I work in the US, I'm constantly integrating, or not integrating, but I'm being primarily introduced to their health and safety representatives who are actual lawyers,
Oh,
or
okay.
regulatory personnel. So
Hmm.
I'm not dealing with the health and safety side of things anymore. It's all about risk management in terms of how it pertains to the risk for a company or their shareholders, and not necessarily um, focusing on the health and safety of the employees and how that can contribute to a better workplace environment. So
Right.
when I find that more on the U.S. side where I have that kind of an issue to deal with. But that being said, we also know that there are pockets that are wonderful on the U.S. side that are tackling
Hmm.
fatigue management. As in Canada, we have some of the same problems too. It's just a little bit more socially liberal up here. And so there's a little
Hmm.
bit more of a drive towards the health and safety aspect of our employees. We care a little bit more in that regard. Uh,
Okay.
Not to say that you don't on the US side, it's just it comes out through our policies a little bit more because our political culture helps to dictate that.
Okay.
Um, on the global aspect, if we look at it from the fatigue science perspective and people like me that actually operate in the field, we're very globally united in what needs to be done.
Yeah.
And it's only going to be through more conferences, through more speaking engagements, through more awareness that we can drive those messages into organizations. But I think a bigger driver is going to be the development of standards and best practices. So again, up here, what we're doing is we've got the very first fatigue management standard in the world being developed specifically for first responders. So you can
Perfect.
imagine the stress and the fatigue that these personnel,
Yes.
law enforcement and ambulance, paramedics, firefighters,
Hmm.
everything that they face. So I think it's going to be through standards as opposed to more prescriptive regulations that are going to help create that unified front that we want. Because regulations are usually prescriptive rules. Don't do this, do this, whereas standards will be a compendium of best practices to get the most out of your program for the benefit
Hmm.
of all, a win-win. So I think that's a direction that we need to go. It's slowly coming, but the awareness is picking up. As you've noted, the NSC has jumped on fatigue. They're doing great promotions. We need to capitalize on that. Now
Yes.
we need to get it internal in the organizations. But it's tough if the gatekeeper of this information is a lawyer instead of a health and safety person.
Okay. Yeah, no, no, absolutely. And I think having that open communication for the health of your employees, for the safety of your employees, I think is going to make such a big difference, especially I think as we fingers crossed, hopefully leave this this COVID era and really come out the other side with a more broad understanding as to how to take care of the workers that are within your organization and
Yeah,
how to have that be more of an open communication instead of, I'm only interested in the job you're doing. but not the reasons why maybe that job isn't being done.
Well, and what I love, excuse me, about the younger generations is that they come in with a very clear agenda, for lack of a better word, that what's important to them is work-life balance. And when
Yes.
you look at the baby boomers who are slowly leaving, but who are still in control of a lot of organizations,
Mhm.
their adage was hard work. It was focused on hard labor, and it was focused on, that was the only way to get ahead, and work defined you. And they sacrificed not just sleep, they sacrificed family
Mhm.
and other social activities to get ahead because their work defined them. And again, it was that badge of honor. Look what I've done. Look what I've accomplished. But the younger generations, and God bless them, they're coming in with the attitude that, work doesn't define me. It's about how does work supplement what I want out of life. And I
Mhm.
think that the tech communities have kind of realized that more than anybody else because they're driven by younger generations rather than some of the old stalwart organizations that are out there. So they
Mhm.
get it. And it's slowly coming into some of those more traditional organizations. But it's a slow haul, and it's a lot of prodding. But it's sink or swim if you don't, as an organization, adapt to the new cultures and the new workforces. You're not going to survive.
Right. And I think it's growing as an organization. It's making your workforce ultimately work for you. This is about, having that open communication and understanding your employees, because if an employee feels valued at work, they will do more. Their productivity goes up, their morale goes up.
Mhm.
It's that kind of trickle down effect, as I like to see within an organization, of creating good workspaces.
Yeah, and I think it even goes beyond that as well, especially from a fatigue perspective, because what
Mhm.
organizations don't understand right now, they're already managing fatigue, but they're managing it at the back end.
Right.
Because it's fatigue is showing itself in terms of errors, poor quality workmanship, um, absenteeism. We know that people who get 5 hours of sleep versus those who get 7 hours of sleep, the ones who get 5 hours take twice as many days off in terms of absenteeism.
Right.
So there's so many other issues that they need to recognize as a business case. So when I go into an organization, if I walk up to a manager and say, you got to worry about your tired employees, they're going to go, whatever. But if I can say to them, hey, Mr. Trucking Company, did you know that tired truck drivers drive closer to the truck in front of them when they're tired? Because that means they don't have to be as situationally aware of everything else going on around them. They just react to the truck in front of them.
Mm.
Consequently, when you're tired, you have a slowed reaction time, which means there's a lot more heartbreaking episodes now as you react to the truck
Yes.
in front of you, which in turn then feeds into the fact that when you have more heartbreaking episodes, you're harder on the equipment, more wear and tear, and they drive up fuel costs. Now, what is the number one concern within a trucking organization? Their number one cost factor? Fuel costs.
Fuel.
So
Hmm.
now, by presenting the business case, they understand why it's a win-win to manage fatigue. Not just, we're not coddling the employees. We're making this
Right.
a good, strong company because we care about the employees, and in turn, it's going to reap those benefits.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for Mike, for joining us today. I This has been just a great discussion, and I just love hearing your thoughts and just of how to combat fatigue, because it's such a prevalent issue in today's workforce.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
absolutely is. And my pleasure being here. Thank you so much for giving me the platform to talk about it because I love talking about it.
No, that's great. And thank you all for joining DORN's Injury Prevention Academy. Tune in next time to learn more about the innovative steps and programs, and ways to combat different issues in today's world of safety.